back to the Majority Report. I am Michael Brooks. Joining us now is Christy Thornton. She is an assistant professor at Johns Hopkins University. She just published AMLO and the State of Mexico for NACLA. Christy, you're calling from Mexico City. Thanks for being here.
Of course. Glad to be here.
So let's just re-review. We actually had a conversation probably about 10 months ago or so about Andrés Manuel López Obrador, his politics, where he's coming from, the type of coalition that he's built in his campaign, and now victory for the presidency. But bring people just back up to date with who he is, both from a biographical and ideological standpoint.
Yeah, so AMLO, as he's known, comes from the southern state of Tabasco. He came up through the ranks of the ruling, at the time, the only party, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. There were smaller opposition parties, but they ran Mexico as a one-party state. He was an indigenous affairs commissioner in the federal government, sort of clashed with the party. The PRI was part of an insurgency within the party to try and democratize it in the 1980s, split off and became a member of the left-leaning Party for the Democratic Revolution after the fraudulent 1988 elections, and worked within that party really until the 2012 elections, the second time he ran for president, when it became clear that that party no longer had a kind of left vision and had been taken over really by this kind of center-right faction. And so, as happens frequently in these kind of establishment parties in Mexico, they have these various fractions within them. The left party had been kind of taken over by center and right people, so he split off after he lost his second bid for the presidency in 2012. And formed his own party, the Movement for National Regeneration, or Morena. That it officially became a political party in 2014. And that's really the point after which he began running for president. As I said, this is his third time running for president. He's finally been successful after a fraudulent election in 2006, where he lost by less than half a percentage point, and a more decisive one in 2012, where he lost to the current president, Enrique Peña Nieto.
And where is he coming from politically? I think that some of it from my reading, and specifically from reading you, it seems like you could really place very specifically to Mexican politics. Then there's these, generic parallels that people try to draw. Is he more like Chavez or like Lula? Most sort of ludicrous. Some people have said, well, he doesn't like the media and he doesn't like elites. So obviously that's like Trump. But where, and also I should say specifically with regards to issues like, say, if we can include in this like indigenous issues in Mexico or the rights of women or LGBTQ communities. So in some places, if you talk about a kind of left-leaning nationalist, that might not be a strong indication of a positive policy towards indigenous communities, right? Like particularly in a place like Turkey. And then we also know that for this campaign, he had to build a very broad coalition, some people to the left of him, but also with an evangelical tendency as well. So where on the map, I guess, where is he politically, and what do these kind of alliances and background mean?
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right that he built a kind of broad coalition for this election. It included this small fringe right-wing evangelical party called Encuentro Social, Social Encounter. They are, sort of vehemently anti-abortion, gay marriage, women's rights. And so that was really problematic for a lot of people on the left. The idea, I think, from his campaign was that party has some power in some places where his formation, Morena, was less likely to win. They remain a fringe party, and so within his governing coalition, I think they'll be a very small part. But people are right to sort of give pause to that. One important thing about the rights of women in this campaign is that AMLO's cabinet and going forward, actually the entire Congress will have gender parity. So 50-50 women and men. López Obrador was very clear from the beginning that he would make half of his cabinet women. And there is a really incredible range of very talented women who have joined his team and will be part of his cabinet. The woman running, who actually won the mayorship of Mexico City from his party, Claudia Sheinbaum, is also a Morena candidate, also from this formation. As with regard to sort of where it fits on a political spectrum, you're right that people have drawn all sorts of crazy comparisons. And I think it just shows the sort of lack of utility of the idea of lumping things together as populism when you could put Hugo Chavez and Donald Trump in the same basket in that way. There is a sense that politics in Mexico is kind of exceptional. Trends that have happened in larger senses in Latin America have not happened here throughout history, and there's always been a kind of Mexican exceptionalism. So there is some sense in which AMLO comes from a kind of particular Mexican tradition, that is, believing in the use of the state for a kind of distributive project that is about sort of a reconciliation between business classes, capitalist interests, but making sure to keep in mind and keep front and center the needs of the working class and the poor and the indigenous people. So in this way, he draws from a kind of long tradition of Mexican leftism that is not so much linked to larger international tendencies. That said, I think what we saw in the campaign and what we know from how he governed when he was the mayor of Mexico City is that he's very pragmatic. He's not at all an ideologue, and that's something that makes the comparisons with Hugo Chavez really strange, because he does not have this kind of strong ideological bent that really marked so much the turn towards socialism under Hugo Chavez, and that was so important for Chavez's project. So I think we can expect to see him govern pragmatically. I think that within his cabinet and within his movement, there are people who are very strongly to the left and who already have said to me that they will be pushing from within the governing coalition to make sure that the right-wing tendencies, that is this small evangelical party, his alliances with some members of the business class, that the left project that they see is not alienated by those tendencies. There are important businessmen, for instance, who've come into the coalition. And so it has been a very pragmatic campaign. He's a very pragmatic politician.
Yeah, I want to tease out that business connection, and I have a read on it, and I want to run it by you. Mm-hmm. It seems like that partially, like what he's done, because he also, it seems in some ways the comparisons to Lula maybe make some sense, although it's a really different context, and Lula, obviously, it seems like they have really different kind of personalities and styles. And Obrador talked a lot about corruption. And one area where I guess people have focused on that, he's not providing enough details, or he isn't saying the sort of tough choices you have to make. And I just have no way of judging that. I don't know the numbers, obviously. But he's kind of suggested that if we can get rid of systemic corruption in the Mexican state, that the freed up capital of that will be a lot of what will both fund the expansion of, the social justice, welfare state. And then at the same time, as you say, he doesn't have an anti-capitalist position at all, per se. Right. We can clean up corruption, and then capitalism can function properly. And it seems like there is a contingent of business guys who have been drawn to him. And I'll draw like a South Africa comparison. It's a really different context, obviously. But, you have Cyril Ramaphosa in power now, taking over from Zuma, and a big part of it is just can we have a capitalism that fits the rules of like what a 21st century, more developed, normalized place is supposed to look like, versus complete state capture and corruption. So I guess my question is that the synthesis that he's trying to draw? Like, you normalize capitalism and then you redistribute the fruits. And then number two, did the PRI, and particularly in its current iteration under Peña Nieto, did that sort of level of corruption and clientelism reach like an even unparalleled level for like modern Mexico?
Yeah, so those are both really good questions. I think your sort of general diagnosis of the situation is right, in that López Obrador sort of joins a long tradition of kind of state developmentalists in Latin America. And that is to say, he comes from a tradition of people who want to use the capitalist apparatus, right? Like the idea of capitalist development to secure a larger redistributive project. So they want the state to be the mediator between the poor and the working classes and the capitalist class. And they think that they can use the state to sort of create structures to control and funnel the sort of outcomes of capitalist development. There's very much a sense that Mexico should be more developed, should have a more highly functioning higher levels of growth capitalist apparatus than it does, right? Mexico joined the OECD after NAFTA. So the idea is that it's if there can be created a kind of state apparatus that can harness the productive capacity of Mexico's insertion into the global economy and create a kind of distributive apparatus to ensure that the sort of spoils of that are more equally distributed. I think that that's absolutely the kind of vision that he has. It is not a socialist, revolutionary, communist platform in any sense. And so I think that that is how we will continue to see his cabinet develop and his governance develop. With regard to the kind of corruption here in Mexico and how it affected capitalist development here, I think it's fair to say that it has disrupted the kind of normal flow of how you might expect things to work. And so there is a sense from particular parts of the capitalist class here in Mexico, for instance, the businessman who will likely be AMLO's chief of staff is an important kind of investment banker, investor named Alfonso Romo. And he has long been an incredibly important mover and shaker within the kind of industrial and banking class here in Mexico. He looks to the López Obrador project precisely with the idea that it might root out the corruption and make business practice sort of more normal here in Mexico. Under the Peña Nieto administration, not only were levels of corruption at unprecedented levels, and that made Peña Nieto's approval ratings spectacularly low. He reached 12% approval rating in 2017. It meant that, doing business here, the thing that Peña Nieto was supposed to bring was renewed business confidence. I don't know if your listeners will remember that when he was elected in 2012, he appeared on the cover of Time magazine with the headline "Saving Mexico." And the idea was supposed to be that Peña Nieto was supposed to bring back business confidence. The international investor class was supposed to be flocking back to Mexico. And in the main, we have not seen that. And that has been because of corruption and also because of insecurity, because of the continued prosecution of the drug war here and the way in which that has made violence really explode. So under this administration in the past 5 years, we have really seen a kind of lack of stability and in that way, business confidence, right? The one thing that the kind of neoliberal leader is supposed to bring back to the country has been a massive failure under Peña Nieto.
Right. So then, and 12%, sad.
Really, the least popular government in modern Mexican history. I mean, the repudiation is total. It's really incredible to think about. Until 2000, less than 2 decades ago, this was a single-party state where everything happened through the PRI. And in this election in 2018, the PRI's presidential candidate won not a single federal electoral district. Wow. It was a complete and total repudiation of the PRI. And so there's long been a kind of a chant that people use in the streets and protests here where they chant, Mexico sin PRI, Mexico without the PRI, the idea that, you need to remove the PRI to get rid of the corruption. And really in this election, we have seen the voters take a massive step in that direction to really remove the power of this party that governed Mexico unopposed for 70 years. Yeah,
I want to get to like the broader victories of Morena in a second, but so the PRI has lost, and there are some members of the business sector that at the very least can partially support at least as sort of some aspects of an anti-corruption effort. But that being said, and before we even get to the United States, if there is a real reform agenda in Mexico, who does that immediately smack up against, both in terms of the business sector and also, and the cartels? I mean, what does that look like? If the first step is remove the PRI electorally, and now we have to get into like Mexico's deep state, which I wish we could really retire that phrase, but it probably is the right phrase in this instance. What does that look like in terms of the
Yeah.
types of moves he'd have to make and the pushback he can expect?
So I think that's really important. The woman who will take over as what is essentially a position akin to the comptroller general, the person who will be in charge of sort of how all of the federal money and the functioning of the federal government, is a woman named Irma Irendera Sandoval. She is a tireless fighter, comes from a very left-wing family in the southern state of Guerrero, and it is basically her job moving forward to begin to review how the federal government spends its money, where it goes, and where that corruption is. And so when you saw the biggest pushback, I really think, during the campaign from the business classes, from kind of entrenched structures of political power, was really from people who know that their links into illicit money, ghost contracts, no-show jobs, those kinds of things are on the chopping block in the Lopez Obrador administration. So members of the business class who have long benefited from the corrupt way that politics works, if that is no longer the case and Morena has taken either 5 or 6, we'll have final results soon, of the 9 open governorships here in Mexico. If there is no longer this kind of link into the corrupt structures of the state via the PRI or the center-right PAN, the National Action Party, all of a sudden that kind of that your ability to get money from the federal government through that is cut off. And so I think a lot of the opposition we saw was precisely people who knew that their ability to kind of siphon money off in that way will be threatened in this administration. So that, I mean, it's a job. Irma is a friend. I don't envy her the job
Yeah.
that goes ahead of her now under the Lopez Obrador administration. Obviously, Mexico has a massive government, it has a massive budget, and it has a massive amount of federal spending. And so the review of that and the beginning of sort of rooting out, figuring out where the corrupt spending has been happening. And really here in Mexico, it's like once a week, there is a new massive scandal where you find out that there has been a contract awarded to some shadow company and it has gotten hundreds of millions of dollars over years through government spending. So there is a tremendous amount of that kind of corrupt government spending to be rooted out. And that will really be the first task of the Lopez Obrador administration because, as you mentioned, that is one of the main ways they intend to reorient government spending toward social programs and the kind of protection for the poor that have been eroded under the Peña Nieto administration.
What about the cartel aspect of this? I mean, is that over exaggerated in U.S. media where, like, certainly it does seem like they were definitely connected to the Peña Nieto government. They have connections in local politics, and in some areas the security situation is really real. What is his sort of rhetoric on that? And I guess more broadly, maybe we could start opening into, it's like at some point a Mexican president's going to need to confront a U.S. president on cartel policy and the drug war. Maybe, as Derek Davison was saying on my show, maybe AMLO's the one to have that conversation. Trump is almost certainly not the one to hear it. But yeah, let's get to that.
Yeah, so this is a really difficult sort of conjunctural moment, right? We finally have a president coming into power in Mexico since the war on drugs and organized crime, as it's called here in Mexico, really began 10 years ago, 2007, 2008, under former President Felipe Calderón of the right-wing National Action Party. His approach was to send the military into the streets to begin to attack the cartels using military force. And he really did launch a war. It was a literal war with tanks and guns and helicopters and soldiers. And that is why you have seen the violence really skyrocket over this last decade. According to some statistics, and this is disputed by some historians, but last year may have been the most violent year in Mexican history, the highest number of murders and violent crimes. So that aspect of the drug war is something that AMLO has said he wants to reverse. He wants to take the military out of fighting this war. He wants to do things like provide scholarships for young people so that they don't enter the drug trade to begin with. He talks a lot about sort of trying to get young people and people who've been swept into the drug trade because of lack of other kinds of economic opportunity out of it. So he wants to offer these scholarships and kind of offer amnesty to low-level people involved in the cartels who've not been involved in violent crime. Really try to reorient that social structure that provides the base of support, the kind of base through which the cartels work. The question of what will happen at the kind of higher levels in the fight against the cartels is a really difficult one, because over this last decade, what this war on drugs and organized crime has done is pursue what's known in how these things work as the kingpin strategy, right? That is, take out the heads of these cartels.
Right.
And so that's why we have El Chapo Guzman in federal prison in New York. And we've seen the arrest of a number of these kind of high-level people in these various cartels. And what that has led to over the last decade is really a fracturing of power within that sector. So it used to be that there were kind of centralized understandings of power. And we've seen this throughout history in all kinds of mafia history, right? When you take out the guy at the top, the two guys who are underneath begin to battle for power. And then there's a competition within that cartel and it fractures. So we've seen that. And we've seen new formations sort of split off from existing cartels and come out. And some of these new formations are much more violent, much less willing to play by the old rules, the kind of mafia rules that used to govern things. You don't go after families. You don't go after children. Like some of the new cartel formations like Jalisco New Generation are just spectacularly violent, right? And don't have this kind of mafia code that used to govern how these things work. In single party rule under the PRI, there was drug trafficking, there were drug cartels, but everything was sort of contained through parallel and intersecting power structures in the political system under the PRI and in the cartels themselves. And since we have this kind of ironic and sad situation where the opening to electoral democracy here in Mexico, the breaking of the monopoly of power of the PRI, has happened at the same time as the kind of fracturing of these drug cartels. And so the existing structures of power for controlling the cartel violence no longer exist. So that is a serious challenge that faces Lopez Obrador. Getting the military off the streets, sort of demilitarizing and trying to erode the social base for people to join these organizations will be incredibly important. But without a doubt, he's going to confront the Trump administration, which we've seen at home has tried to really return to a much more punitive and militarized understanding of the drug war than was the, sort of the loose trend under the Obama administration. There's kind of a loose international trend that says, we know militarization in the drug war over the last 40 years hasn't worked. And Trump has put the brakes completely on that. Under Attorney General Jeff Sessions, they just want to return to lock them all up, throw away the key, kill them if you have to. And so I think that will be a serious confrontation. What to do about security policy and the drug problem, together with the migration issue, will be some of the big things that lead to confrontation between the Trump administration and the Lopez Obrador administration.